Okay, should be currently recording, and we are ready to begin, Shannon.
Great. Hi, everyone. As John mentioned, my name is Shannon Lochner, and I am the Mills Act Coordinator at the California Office of Historic Preservation. I'd love to thank you all for joining us today. And just as a little kind of primer to my presentation, want to let you know that I really am coming at this from the program coordinator side. I don't have the hands-on experience with administering a program, so this is more kind of the statewide perspective about the variety of programs out there, and at the very basic level, what you should be considering when adopting your program. Oops, let's see. Now I can't advance. There we go. There are today's speakers, as John mentioned, and I really do need to update my CPF resume. I am now going on 10 years at OHP. So to begin with, what is the Mills Act? And this may seem like a really silly place to start, because if most of you are here participating in this webinar, you probably have some sense of what the program is. But just to be clear, it's a local property tax incentive that's designed to encourage restoration or rehabilitation of privately owned properties. One of the things that I find most surprising when working with people that administer the program around the state is that they've maybe inherited the role of program manager at a local government and they don't really actually know where to find the statute. So I just like to point out that the law is actually an enabling legislation, and it's found in the California Government Code, Article 12, Sections 5280 to 5290. And while it is state law, it's simply enabling legislation that creates a very, very loose framework that allows a local government to adopt a program that is right for their community. So a little bit of Mills Act history. This is another thing that obviously Illy knows better than most people, the history of the Act, but it also surprises me that people don't really know kind of the background of the statute, how it's changed over the years. So just as a little, basic information, the Act was created or written by Senator James Mills out of San Diego in 1972, and he really authored the law as a response to a personal friend of his that owned the Hotel del Coronado. Obviously one of our country's, if definitely California's, most beautiful historical resources. And the owner of the property in 72 was really facing pressure to demolish his property and develop it to the highest financial potential. And Senator Mills was frustrated by that. It was largely because of property tax issues and just this development pressure. And so he was looking for a way to help his friend, but help anyone in a similar situation be able to retain their significant resources. He and those that helped author the law based it on the Williamson Act, and you'll see in 1973 very quickly then the act was determined unconstitutional because the basis for the Williamson Act is preservation of open space, and at that time historical resources were not considered to be open space. In 1976, voters approved a constitutional amendment and Mills Act programs began, cropping up around the state. In 1985, the act was amended again, and this was a big one. Early on, from what I understand from the research I've done, programs weren't being utilized very frequently, and a big portion of it was the fact that the original contract terms were for 20 years, and if there was found to be any breach of contract, the actual penalty, which is now 12.5% of fair market value, was 50%. So in 85, they made those changes and reduced the initial contract term down to 10 years and the penalty down to 12.5%, so people took advantage of the program more often. In 93, a small amendment was put in place that just defined more clearly, although I still don't think it's very clear, restoration and rehabilitation. And then most recently in 2012, the Act was amended again, which actually did implement mandatory property inspections before a contract and every 5 years after. Of course, you'll see in a little while that that's an area where there's broad variety in how local governments are handling it. But the other important thing was it allowed local governments to charge a fee, which some had already been doing anyhow, but this really kind of implemented or put in place that almost expectation that a fee would be charged to cover some administrative costs. So some of the basics of the program. The roles are, again, really important to understand. Local governments have all of the authority, and any kind of dispute is handled in the courts or some sort of public process. The Office of Historic Preservation, while I am the Mills Act coordinator for the state, really only serves in an advisory role to both property owners and local governments. Prior to 2012, we were named as having the option to inspect properties, but to the best of my knowledge, that had really never happened. And the Board of Equalization serves in a very similar role to our office in that they advise and interpret the law for the county assessors. So some of the framework. Local governments, again, I feel like I'm on repeat here, but local governments administer the program and have all of the control. You decide which fees are appropriate for your community, and you decide how you're going to perform your inspections. Uh-oh. Oops. We missed one, sorry. That just said properties must meet the definition of a qualified historical property. That is a big piece of the state statute, and we'll get to how you do that in just a second. Obviously, properties must be privately owned and subject to property tax. Contracts run with the title of the property, and I can tell you when I started in the role as Mills Act coordinator in 2007, I was surprised that most of the calls I was fielding were actually from real estate agents, because we were kind of at the peak of the market, and particularly in areas like Southern California where there are a vast number of programs, they were finding that that was something really marketable to potential property owners. And it's starting to happen again as things pick back up. Contracts are for a minimum of 10 years and extend 1 year annually unless either party to the agreement chooses not to renew. And there's a couple of key points to hit on there. There's a lot of confusion about the 10 years and 1 year annually. Some people view the contract as 10 years and then done, and then at that 11th year, a year is added, when in fact it's on the anniversary date, the first year, that one additional year is added. So there's confusion, complication. It's one of those things that just make sure that you understand. If you wish to only have a contract for 10 years, you absolutely must, either the property owner or the local government must issue that notice of non-renewal before the first anniversary if you're planning to keep it within the 10 years. And then the issue of non-renewal versus cancellation is a confusing one. Really, non-renewal is something, there's no problem. It's not because it's not working. It's simply that either party to the contract, chooses not to do this any longer, and you must notify the other party in writing before that anniversary date. Where cancellation is when there is really breach of contract, you go through a public process, and again, if cancellation moves forward, there's that 12.5% penalty of full market value. The county assessors will calculate the Mills Act for you. Typically when I do this presentation, I do get into a little bit of the math, but because I'm just kind of giving a program overview today, I'm not going to. But really, your county assessors are going to be the experts. They're going to be the ones that can help you figure out how much property tax savings each local government is going to be, or how much revenue loss a local government is going to potentially see, or for a private property owner, what their savings will be. So again, now what qualifies? This is the portion that just skipped over accidentally. A qualified historical property is privately owned, it's subject to property tax, and is either listed in the National Register or, and this is what the statute says, listed in any state or local register of historical, architectural resources, sites, or landmarks. And basically the way you meet those are either by being on the California Register, a California landmark, a point of historical interest, or a locally designated property. And this is really key to note. Local governments can and frequently do narrow the definition of what qualifies. So here, this formal definition of a qualified historical property is anything that can be eligible for a Mills Act contract. But most local governments, I would say, really require that a property be listed locally, designated locally, in order to be eligible for a contract. So some of the things local governments grapple with when they're dealing or deciding to implement a program or modify their program in any way. Reasons to adopt, well, of course, it helps retain and maintain historic properties. It's true stewardship, frankly. I was at a camp training about a year and a half ago in San Francisco, and I actually felt really proud because all of the presenters were from out of state, and they were incredibly reputable people. And one of the fellows was doing a presentation on kind of just incentives. And when he learned about the Mills Act, oh, you should have seen him. I wish we could get him in California to cheerlead for the program more frequently, because he genuinely feels like this is the best stewardship program there is in the nation, because it's voluntary, but it does truly incentivize and require that a property owner that's in a contract maintain their property. So, of course, back to my list, the Mills Act it fosters preservation of historic neighborhoods. A biggie is that it can incentivize the revitalization of a downtown commercial district after the economic downturn that we've gone through, and so many of the commercial properties that were vacant, really letting those property owners know that there's an option for them to rehab their buildings and get people back in and back into our historic downtowns is critical. It preserves historic fabric, which helps with heritage tourism, which is another biggie. I love that the program is flexible. I mean, this is key. You as local governments really get to choose the program that's right for your community. And another thing is that it's voluntary. It's a voluntary program for both the local government and for the property owner. Even at the local level, if a property owner, owns a designated property and they're in a community that has a Mills Act program, there's no requirement that you commit to the program. I don't see why you wouldn't, but. And one of the really important things, too, is that it's currently the only incentive that's available to single-family homes in the state of California. So how do you go about adopting your program? Well, there's kind of some confusion out there about this. In fact, I've been at workshops or presentations speaking with people, very reputable people in our field that tend to work with more sophisticated programs. And, that I've listened to somebody say, well, you must have your ordinance and it must say XYZ, when in reality, there's nothing in the statute that says that that's a requirement. While it's probably your strongest and most effective route to implementing a program, you can simply implement a program through adopting a resolution. If you do go the resolution route, though, just from being in this position of kind of watching programs statewide for the last 10 years, I would really recommend having strong administrative guidelines behind your resolution. So maybe a little less formal and harder to get through than an ordinance, but something that explains how your program is going to be run, and something that both new staff members that are, involved with the program and property owners that are curious about it can go to read, so that there's clarity on both sides. An important thing to note is that a program can target certain property types or certain neighborhoods if you wish to. There's nothing in the statute that precludes you from doing that. And local governments choose your method of inspection. We've got cities, very sophisticated cities like the city of Los Angeles, that have contracted out the work, and people are physically going in and doing very rigorous inspections. And there are other communities that just simply don't have the staff time or resources, and so they've resorted to something like self-reporting, sending out a survey every year, and asking property owners, what have you done? Send us some photos. So there really is this broad range that you are allowed to choose. So again, some statewide perspective. There are currently approximately 90 Mills Act programs in the state. I hate to say approximately, but there's nothing in the statute that requires a local government to notify us that they've adopted a program, as silly as that sounds. And so periodically, in my other work with local governments, I will find that they have a program. I'll read an ordinance that says it, and I'm like, wait, I had no idea. So we think there are about 90 programs out there. And there are, strangely, communities out there that this is their only preservation program. They may not even have a commission, and they've found other ways to go about, having a property meet that definition of a qualified historical property. I use the county of Orange as, an example of that. They do have a commission, although they don't have a formal ordinance or designation program, but they had some properties that were in an area that was within the sphere of an influence of a community that did have a program. and some property owners that lived in the unincorporated areas were frustrated that they weren't eligible for a Mills Act contract when their neighbors were. And so we worked with the county to develop a Mills Act program that really the property owners must come to our office and go through the California Register process with the commission, and that's how they choose to have their properties meet the definition of a qualified historical property. So they do exist, as funny as it may seem. Then, of course, there's, you know, the San Franciscos and Los Angeleses that have these robust, amazing programs. So the Mills Act program, in contrast, as you know, as funny as it may sound, as many programs as there are out there, there are no two programs that I've come across that are alike. And it's amazing to me, even amongst communities that are fairly similar in kind of size and scope, size of the local government itself, that there's dramatic variation. I use San Diego and Oakland often as examples when it comes to the number of contracts a community has. San Diego has probably the largest program, although it has slowed down a bit the last few years. They currently have well over 1,000 contracts, where Oakland, a city that's, you know, similar in size and scale, has less than 50 contracts. Fees are another area where there's dramatic variation. There are still some local governments that choose not to charge a fee despite the 2012 amendment that kind of stated that they probably should. And then there are other communities. The highest I've ever heard was $6,500, which I think probably, and that's a very slow program in the North Bay area, that, you know, I think that they learned that by charging a fee at that level, there's not much of an incentive anymore. They just weren't getting the use of the program they expected to see. And then inspections. After those 2012 amendments, like I said, you know, I mean, we've got communities that have gone to the extreme, and which is great, of really, you know, contracting out and doing on-site inspections, crawling in crawl spaces, down to the other, you know, extreme where they're just allowing property owners to self-report. And, you know, and somewhere in the middle, maybe what works for your community. I know the city of San Diego has a huge program, and I've spoken with their planner, and what she does is, you know, she goes out a couple of days a month and targets a particular neighborhood, and she has her list of addresses that have, you know, have a contract. And she checks off, you know, she just walks by and, you know, has her headphones on, she said, and enjoys her afternoon being out, and really goes through a checklist of things that they were supposed to do, and on her own does that. So, you know, again, there's broad variation here. So I guess, you know, my final point would be what I started with, you know, on the title slide, is just really build the community or the program that's right for your community, because not one size does fit all. And really our goal is just to, you know, incentivize the retention of these really significant resources. So thank you all for joining me. If you have any questions, don't ever hesitate to contact me at OHP. I love having phone calls. I mean, as John mentioned, the rest of my work is HUD project review and stuff like that. So I really love the Mills Act, and I love to chat with communities that are, you know, thinking of adopting a program, that are modifying their program, and help property owners get through the process as well. So thank you all. John, do I need to?
Yeah, 1 second, sorry. My mouse is giving me issues here. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Illy. In the meantime, I see that there are a few questions that came in for Shannon.
Oh, okay. In the chat.
I don't know if we want to answer them now, or, I mean, I'm assuming we could answer them now just because they're the most relevant to your presentation.
Sure.
So there's two questions. The first one was, what are the Mills Act application fees in your community? Maybe this is.
I would actually really be curious. Well, that's what I was going to say, is really, you know, in my role as statewide coordinator, one of the best things that I can do is put you all in contact with one another, because I don't administer a program, but I am fairly good at finding communities of similar size and scale and sophistication to connect you with planners that have some experience, and just to hear you all chat. You know, do take advantage of, we've got, if you're a certified local government, we've got our listserv. We like to get it questions out, that you guys can share that information, because you all really are one another's best resources.
Okay. Great. And we had somebody raise their hand, so I've promoted them to panelists just to see if they wanted to ask in person. So I just unmuted you, Confroom, your question. Maybe their microphone isn't working, so I encourage you to try typing in your question in the chat box below. The second, or somebody had a comment. Beverly Hills filing fee is $1,500 for what it's worth.
I would say that's pretty average too. I think that anywhere from the $700s to about $2,000 seems to be the standard range.
Okay. Another question came in the Q&A box, which I'm pulling up here. Looks like the question was, do you know of any municipality that limits the contract period to 10 years?
Sorry, I was on mute. I don't yet, but that does seem to be something that's starting to come up. I know there are a couple of communities that are currently talking about automatically issuing non-renewal. Communities that are just building a program because they're concerned about being able to manage it and wanting, another thing that's happening right now is that local governments are putting caps on the amount of revenue they'll lose, or caps on the number of contracts they'll have at one time. And so I think the thought is that by issuing the non-renewal right away, they'll open the program up to other property owners. I really hate to see that happen, because I do think that, all of us in this field recognize that it's expensive to maintain a historic home or building, and the property tax savings isn't such that, you really are losing so much money, but it's definitely something that people are starting to talk about. Okay. I think South Pasadena and Benicia have both thrown the idea around.
Great. I think that's everything that's come in so far. So we'll wait for the other questions to come in for the second and third presentations. Feel free to type in your questions as the speakers are presenting, and they may be answered by one of the speakers through typing the response in through the Q&A box. So we're going to move it over to Illy, and Illy, I just handed off control to your mouse, so you should have it.
Okay.
And then you want me to maximize the screen here?
Sure.
Yeah, here we go. All right. We're ready for you.
Okay. First of all, welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. Hello to my friend Shannon and to Katie. So hopefully we're going to be able to share some information that'll be useful for you and your community. I'm going to be giving a perspective of my time at Monrovia. So a lot of the examples that you'll have will be from that. What we're going to talk about first is what do you want your Mills Act program to accomplish in your community? And then we're going to talk about possible property types that will be in your Mills Act contract. Will you look at limiting the number of contracts or the assessed value each year? And will there be any standard or specific conditions for your contract? And how will you monitor the terms of not only the regulations in the Mills Act state legislation, but any additional standard or individual conditions that you place on the property? And how can you allow for any time extensions to complete any of those required conditions that you had placed a timeline of when they should have been completed? A little bit about the city of Monrovia. Monrovia is located about 20 miles east of Pasadena, of Los Angeles, about 10 from Pasadena. It's about a community, about 36,500 people. At the time that I left, we had actually 136 landmarks, of which 124 had Mills Act contracts. They have since approved 2 more landmarks with Mills Act contracts. There's also 1 historic district, 3 national registered properties, and it's a community that was incorporated in 1887. with about 14,000 housing units. So that's to give you an idea of the size of the community that Monrovia is. As Shannon mentioned in her presentation, you really need to assess your community to determine what kind of a Mills Act program is going to be best for you guys. So do you want to just target any potential or existing historic properties or districts that need maintenance? In other words, are you going to have a program that's going to be hoping that those that need maintenance come forward to get that Mills Act? Or do you just merely want to encourage property owners to come forward and landmark their properties? In Monrovia, I wanted to go back because a lot of people are wondering how to implement a program. The way that Monrovia implemented their program is they did it through a ordinance. It's their historic preservation ordinance. It talks about the landmarking process, and then in that ordinance, they talk about different incentives, of which the Mills Act is one of the incentives. They also have the incentive of using the state historic building code. They also have incentives for setback flexibility, parking deviations. So the Mills Act is one of the incentives that's located within their ordinance. I personally like the way that Monrovia adopted the program. I know that the city of Covina, which is close to Monrovia, adopted their regulations similar to Monrovia's. But again, it's what's worked for Monrovia may not work for somebody else. I'm trying to go page down here. Okay. Jonathan, I'm trying to go to the next screen. And it's not letting me.
Oh, Illy, I think I may have mentioned you have to click once because I had to mute myself and it gave me back control.
I got it.
Yeah. Now try the keyboard.
There we go. Yay. Okay. So what the city of Monrovia did when they adopted their program is that they included both single family, multiple family, and commercial properties to be able to qualify for a Mills Act contract. There may be some communities that could limit it, and I've got some examples that I'll share with you that might limit it to just single family and multiple family and exclude commercial. But in Monrovia, we felt that we had a wealth of properties out there that we wanted to come forward to landmark and get a Mills Act contract. So what I provided here's an example. The one on the far left is a single family house. It just happens to be the Upton Sinclair house. Beautiful property. Was put on the National Register several years prior to it to the property owner coming forward and landmarking it so that they could get a Mills Act contract. In the middle, we have a multiple family development. These are actually 15 Craftsman bungalow units, and they came forward and landmarked the entire property to get the Mills Act contract. And then the far one on the right was one that was approved as a landmark with the Mills Act contract just last year. It's a commercial property. So you can see that the way it was modeled in Monrovia was to allow all these three different types of properties to come forward. Now, I do know that there are some other cities that do just say that, just single family and multiple residential properties, which is fine. If that works for your community, then by all means, that's one of the stipulations that you'll want to put forward in your contract. Okay, can you set a limit to number of contracts and applications that you accept each year? You definitely can. As Shannon mentioned in her presentation, that some communities do that. As a matter of fact, I was kind of looking last night at some different Mills Act contract regulations that are out there in the community. And the city of South Pasadena does set a limit. They're one community that I found that they grant only 4 Mills Act contracts per year. The city of Pasadena, which is right next door to South Pasadena, they limit it to no more than 20 single family residences a year and 6 multiple family, commercial, or industrial properties per year. So yes, you can limit the number of contracts. If you've got an abundance, as I said before, you would definitely want to, control if you feel that the tax losses to the city would be substantial. Can you set a deadline for when to receive your applications? By all means. In Monrovia, we would not accept any applications after the end of June. The reason being is because of limited staff and staff time. We wanted to make sure that we could process the application through our Historic Preservation Commission and then through our City Council before the end of the year. The reason you want to do it before the end of the year, that then gave our property owners time to go to the county assessor to file all the documentation of the approval of their contract so that then their tax benefits could take effect beginning July 1st of the following year. You can also limit your contracts to not exceed a maximum assessed value. And again, the city of Pasadena does this with their single-family properties. They do not take any properties that are over 1.5 million in assessed value. So, that is one. I'm sure there's plenty of other communities that might want to limit the value of the properties. We did not do that in Monrovia. We do not have abundance of homes that are over, say, $1 million in assessed value. So that was not a limit that was put at the time. But it doesn't mean that once you adopt your Mills Act ordinance that you can't come back later and make changes as the values of properties change. So do you want to consider any standard or individual conditions for your contracts? There are the standard conditions, as Shannon mentioned, that the Mills Act itself has, preserving and protecting the property, keeping it in good condition. But you can put some standard conditions, as we did in Monrovia. Every property had the same standard conditions. And you can also require specific conditions, which we also did in Monrovia. And I will go over those in a second. Here we go, next slide. So one of the standards, and here's a list of standard conditions that we required for all of the properties with the Mills Act contract. And then, of course, if you're going to do any kind of exterior alterations or you're going to do any additions to the structure, you would have to go through a certificate of appropriateness process. You had to, of course, keep the view corridor open for the public so that they can enjoy it. So from the public right away, you should be able to see the home. That was really there for the enjoyment, the visual enjoyment of the community. Within 2 years, you needed to install a Historic Preservation Commission approved plaque. This was a plaque that there was a company that the homeowners would go to specifically because we wanted to maintain uniformity in the style of the plaque. Everybody loved to do that. I mean, some people would want to come just landmark their property because, oh my gosh, they were going to put a plaque. And of course, we wanted the plaque to be located so that it could be seen from the right-of-way. Another important condition that we placed on all the properties was an electrical inspection report. This had to be done on letterhead from an electrical contractor. And basically, as we all know, nobody's got x-ray vision. You can't see inside the walls. But definitely there were some stipulations that were placed in those conditions, and that said that you had to at least have your GFI outlets, near your water sources, and your electricity had to be grounded. So that was something we required for everybody with the Mills Act contract. And then here's the biggie, was that within 10 years of the contract, from the day that you signed that contract with the City Council, you needed to seismically retrofit your home. This was the biggest one only because in some cases it could be expensive for a property owner. It could be minimal. The specifics we placed on it that it had to be seismically bolted to a approved foundation. So with the approved foundation, basically, if you're on River Rock and you have no footings, you're probably not going to be considered a approved foundation. This was something that they would work with our building department on. And so I saw some that could, for as easily as little as say $2,000 to $3,000, they could bolt their existing house to an approved foundation. And then I have seen some that were river rock foundations who had to build an entire sister wall, and we're looking at anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 to do that. Any exterior improvements, which we individualized per property, did require a certificate of appropriateness. And the biggie, which is this last one, is one that we had that I actually have a lot of questions from people, is that you had to provide the city with a progress report every 2 years for the 10 years, first 10 years of the contract, and then every 5 years thereafter. And it was interesting because we made that amendment to our standard conditions prior to the new legislation that came into effect in 2012 that Shannon mentioned, that they now require you to do 5 years an inspection. And what we would do immediately when we got a contract, we would go out to the property and inspect the property. We'd go with the property owner. We'd look at their list of conditions that they wanted to accomplish, and then we would add conditions if necessary. So this one was one that probably a lot of people are wondering, well, how are you going to monitor that? And I'll give you an example in a minute. Here's an example of some specific conditions. Usually, when you're looking at some older homes, we had quite a few that actually had some walkways and some driveways that had a lot of cracks and damages that were really very, very noticeable. So we had several properties who, within either their first 2 to 4 years of their contract, would be required to either repair it or replace it. I use this number 2 as an example only because if you see the property, the Tudor home on the left there, they actually had a wall-mounted air conditioning unit. If you look on the right side of the house, you'll see an American flag, and right beyond the American flag, you see this little kind of a white square sticking out. They actually had that wall-mounted, not a window-mounted, but a hole-in-the-wall mounted air unit, and that was actually their driveway on the right side. So if we were to scoot over a little bit to the right, you'd be able to see very noticeably that air conditioning unit. So one of the conditions we placed on this property was within their first 2 years, they needed to replace that air unit, which they did do, and then they repaired the wall. They filled it in and they re-stuccoed, and you couldn't even tell that it was ever there. One that we had that was very common was a lot of the upgrade that was done like in the 50s and 60s, and why they would want to remove those wonderful old wood windows and put those louvered things in there. We just never could understand that, but we did have some properties that had some louvered windows, and they would, of course, have to go through a certificate of appropriateness to replace those windows with period-style windows. If they were windows that were at the front of the property, very visible, it would be something we would probably put a 2 or a 4 year time limit. If there were properties that were, windows that were in the back part of the property, then we'd look at maybe just to do that within those first 10 years of the contract. Another common one was a front door. Those beautiful old front doors were gone and some new thing was put on. So we had a few actually that had to replace their front door with a period style door. The removal of all front yard fencing if it was chain link. In Monrovia, a property, whether you're single family or multiple family, is not permitted to have chain link fence within the front yard setback. That's all along the front and down the sides of the house. It was visually unattractive, and it was something in the ordinance that applied citywide. But we couldn't require people to remove their chain link fence unless, of course, they had a Mills Act contract. So of the ones that we have processed in Monrovia, I do remember that one gentleman had a chain link fence. He was required to remove it within the first, I think we either gave him 4 or 6 years. And a most recent one had a chain link fence. It was pretty well hidden by a lot of growth. You really couldn't see it. So one of the conditions was that if they were ever to remove the shrubbery that the chain link fence would have to go to. In Monrovia, we only monitored the existing outside, the outside of the house. We did not monitor the interior unless there was something very unique about some element on the inside. And probably one of the most common things was several homes did have Batchelder tiled fireplaces. So when that would occur, we would put in their specific conditions that they would preserve that fireplace. We did, right before, let's see, towards the end of last year, we did have one property that came forward for a contract. It had an incredible river rock chimney, fireplace and chimney. It was absolutely spectacular, both inside and outside. So we did include that as a specific condition to preserve. So now, how do we monitor those contract terms? Not only the basic ones in the contract, but in our case in Monrovia, our standard ones for everyone and our specific ones. We only had 3 staff members. I mean, we, you know, as planners come and go, we had 5 at one time, we had 4, but generally we had 3 planners. So as you can imagine, staff time was at a premium, but I always made a point of keeping up on all my Mills Act contracts. And for us, what worked the best way was self-reporting. We wanted the property owner to be conscientious of, okay, it's now my 2-year anniversary, my 4-year anniversary. Since in Monrovia, we wanted updates every 2 years for those first 10 years. So we kind of counted on people to, you know, get back to us. Unfortunately, it didn't always happen. So we designed a very simple postcard, wanted to, you know, save on mailing. And we also had email addresses that we would collect when they would bring in, you know, their Mills Act applications. So you'll want to include those email addresses on there. And then we would send courtesy reminders. Hey, you know, just want to let you know your anniversary date's coming up and we haven't heard from you. Can you please provide us an update? We made the update process very simple. You could easily send me an email and just say, hey, within the last 2 years, here's a list of things that we did to our property. And they would identify if it was any of them that were specific in their conditions. And sometimes I would get an incredibly elaborate updates. I would get binders with before and after pictures. I always loved getting those, so those were great. But we didn't have a requirement as how they had to update us. We kind of went on the honesty system. I do know that there are some communities out there who specifically want to see receipts for the work that they've done, and then they take those receipts, and those receipts have to add up for the amount of savings that they had on their from their Mills Act contract. We didn't do that. We didn't have the staff to do that. But that doesn't mean that's not something that'll work for your community. We also had that if they were delinquent, in other words, if they didn't meet their timeline of the, you know, what was required at the 2 or the 4, we would tell them that if we didn't hear from them, that we would put them on the Historic Preservation Commission agenda for review of possible non-compliance. In other words, here, these are the conditions that are in your contract. You're not complying with the time frame. So we're going to have the Historic Preservation Commission look at your contract. I can tell you that as soon as that postcard came out, usually within an hour, sometimes by the next day, I would have the update on their conditions. So there were a few times that we did have to take the item to the Historic Preservation Commission, and then the commission dealt with it by just, you know, talking to them, and they would, in all cases, I always got the update immediately. So here I'm giving you an example. This is an Excel chart that I designed to be able to monitor our contracts, and this would be, you know, individualized for you. But I have the Mills Act and the historic landmark number. I'd have the address, the owner, the email, phone number. I put the city council approval date because from that date, every 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years is when I would require those updates. and then you can see the 15, the 20, and then on. You know, your community could be different. You might just do one every 5 years, so you could modify it and say, you know, 5 and 10 and 15 and so on. I have a column for the electrical inspection. I also have one for the seismic because those were two conditions that were standard for everybody. And on the other column, I would have any additional things that they needed to do. If there was a lot, I would just put the number or the word many in there so that I could just refer to their specific file. But here I would just put the date that they finally gave me their update, or I would put okay. And so it was a sheet that it was very easy to look at it quickly and see who was and who wasn't complying with their timelines. So because we placed specific time limits on when we wanted everything to, you know, be presented to us with their updates, we did have a process for the property owner to go through to request a time extension, because it does take a little bit of staff time to put together a staff report. So we have a very simple one-page application of what they wanted the time extension for. Almost every one of these that I got, it was for the seismic retrofit. We did also charge a fee, a minimal fee, to be able to process this application. And I have like a specific situation where a Millsack property owner sold the property. They were 8 years into the contract. They had not done the seismic retrofit. They, of course, disclosed it to the new owner. So the new owner comes in and saying, oh my gosh, you know, I only have 2 years left. There's no way. We just bought this house. So the new owner came forward with an application for a time extension. And we always tell people, you know, request a time that's going to be feasible for you. Don't feel like, oh my goodness, I have to have it done right away. You know, put a time suggestion, and either the commission will agree or maybe they'll say, oh no, we think you can do it in less time. Generally, the time that the person requested for a time extension was approved. I do remember in one situation a property owner says, oh, you know, I'll finish the seismic in 6 months, and the commission says, you know what, let's just give you a year. That way, if things aren't done, you don't have to come back and go through this process again. And it worked out great because they actually did still complete it within their 6 months that they had originally requested. Okay, on my last slide that I presented here is it's important to remember that the Mills Act will impact a city of the portion of the city's portion of the property taxes. And so what we did is we kept really pretty good documentation of all of our properties based on the information that right here you see a copy of a letter that we would get every year from our county assessor. And this letter went not only to the property owner, but it also came to the city. So we had a list, like kind of like similar to the Excel chart that I had, you know, historical landmark number 1, Mills Act number 1, the address, and then we would put these values in there. And we provided a financial update to our city council every year. We wanted them to know this is how many contracts we have with Mills Act contracts. Here are the tax implications to the city. So our council always knew what was going on, and this is really good also in case you have anybody coming in and questioning, hey, you know, how come that person is, you know, getting to save all this money on their taxes, and, you know, the city's not getting all these, you know, these monies, but, you know, so you're keeping good documentation of, well, hey, look here's the list of all the things that they've done to their property. So they're abiding by the terms of their contract. So it's good to keep that documentation. To talk just real briefly about what the assessor does, as you can see here, every year they reassess the property on 3 different methods. The Prop 13 value, that's the value of the property. Say that they had never gotten a Mills Act contract. You know, based on their buying price, there would be a valuation of the property there based on what Prop 13 would have entitled them to. Then the assessor always had what is the current market value of the property. Then they would have the Mills Act appraised value, And this was done based on a formula that's found in the Tax and Revenue Code. And then it would be the enrolled value. And the reason that they did this is because there was an amendment to the Mills Act that what ended up happening after a property owner owned their property for a significant amount of time, there did come a point where they were not receiving the Mills Act value anymore. Because of the calculation methods, they were now receiving their Prop 13 value. And in Monrovia, there were, I believe, about 6 properties that had had a Mills Act contract back since like 1995. And they had owned the property even prior to that. So their Prop 13 value was now less than their Mills Act value, but they were able to partake in the benefits of the Mills Act for all the years up until the point where now their Prop 13 value took over. Again, we don't want the financial impacts to deter anybody from getting a Mills Act contract ordinance. Just always keep in mind that there are great economic benefits to historic preservation. So, any questions?
Thank you, Ellie. We will move over to Katie in a minute here, but I just wanted to be sure that all the questions have been addressed. There was one question, Ellie, during the course of your presentation, and the question, maybe any of the speakers can address this if they'd like, is what are the tax savings for the commercial property in the example? This was specifically for you. What are the tax savings for the commercial property in the example shown? Do you find in your community that commercial properties accrue less savings on average as compared to single-family residences?
The commercial property that we had, and Shannon can maybe add a little bit to this too, the formula in the Tax and Revenue Code, when you're a multiple family or a commercial property, there's a 2% calculation code that's used versus a 4% for the single family. So on the commercial property that I had a picture of, that was a recently acquired property. So the cost of the property was substantial. I did not get to see the final value because the paperwork would have come out sometime in the middle of this year. So it probably would have been substantial only because of the fact that it was a recently purchased one.
Okay, thank you. There were a few questions from the attendees about your contact.
In general, I'll add real quickly, in general,
sure.
We would see across the board on the 124 Mills Act contract. I'm sorry, what?
Oh, I'm back. You can hear me, right? It looks like we were briefly disconnected.
I think so.
Yeah, I think we're all here, though. So I just wanted to go back to the share screen window. Okay. And just to double check, I want to be sure there aren't any more questions. Oh, there was another question. Illy, if you're still here, let me try this again. Bear with me here. I'm trying to get Illy back in the room. Okay. All right, Illy, so I think we lost you briefly. Not sure why, but you're back. There was one more question that we'll address before we move over to Katie. And the question was, how old is the Monrovia program and how did property owners become aware of the Mills Act benefits? Did the city do any marketing in the past, and does the program have any current marketing efforts?
The ordinance was adopted at the end of 1994. The city of Monrovia has a very active historic preservation group in town, so they are very involved in marketing and making people aware of the program. So our realtors have all become very knowledgeable about the program and are familiar with it. So that is, we personally as a city don't go out and market it. There's a lot of information that the city of Monrovia has on their website, you know, brochures, all applications, anything you need to know about the program. There's a great historic preservation site